Some listeners to my series of epic scenes on the Silmarillion have inquired where exactly the plot of the Fall of Gondolin fits into the world of Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It belongs to the vast body of unfinished writings generically entitled The Silmarillion, which were only published after Tolkien's death in a series of editions by his son Christopher. The one-volume Silmarillion itself, another one-volume compilation entitled Unfinished Tales, a further 12-volume History of Middle-earth, and most recently a single volume comprising most of the material Tolkien himself wrote for the Fall of Gondolin, which had previously only been available scattered throughout the various earlier publications. Without labouring the matter, the plot can best be summarised by stating that it contains, among other elements, the story of the meeting of Elrond's grandparents and the destruction of the hidden elven city of Gondolin, events which are mentioned in retrospect both in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's work on the legends related to the Fall of Gondolin extended indeed throughout his creative career. The so-called Lost Tale was the first of his stories of Middle-earth to be completed, and he was working on the tragedy of Eöl and Maeglin almost to the end of his life. When I was constructing the text for my series of epic scenes, I made use of both the very early saga and the very late one, as well as fragments of other works written in between. Whereas in a film script, for example, the emphasis is inevitably on the visual elements of the plot, for musical terms the main concern is with dramatic dialogue and lyrical writing which is suitable for setting for solo voices and chorus. I have explained both on my website and in the booklet notes for the CD release how far I had to extend my net in order to capture suitable material. For example, the score of the Fall of Gondolin opens with a poem by Tolkien entitled The Bidding of the Minstrel, written as early as 1914, although later revised, which predates even the earliest connected work on what was to become in due course the Silmarillion. In it, listeners ask a minstrel to tell them the story of Eärendil, who in Tolkien's legends was Elrond's father, born in Gondolin as the son of a union between the mortal Tuor and the elf maiden Idril. But the minstrel replies that he can only recall shreds one remembers of golden imaginings fashioned in sleep, a description that can, perhaps, justly be applied to the various fragments of the tale of the Fall of Gondolin that Tolkien wrote from the 1920s onwards. After this introduction, the text plunges into the story of the foundation of the hidden city of Gondolin. The Valar Ulmo, the angelic demiurge who controls the waters of the sea, gives instructions to the exiled elven king Turgon to build a refuge for the elves who are seeking shelter from the forces of Morgoth, the evil enemy who is seeking their destruction for reasons that have already been explained in earlier parts of the epic scenes, in particular the opening drama of Feanor. The chorus describes the glories of the city and extols the beauty of Turgon's sister Arathel and his daughter Idril, the fairest of all the wonders of Gondolin. Arathel, wandering away from the city, is ensnared by the dark elf Eol, who takes her to wife, and at this point the score evokes memories of my vocal setting of the song Shadow Bride, which readers may recognise as one of the Hobbit poems collected by Tolkien in The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, and listeners may encounter in its original song form on the CD of my music Akala Beth. Here it describes how she conceives and gives birth to her son Maeglin, who will ultimately bring about the betrayal and fall of the city. When Arathel returns to Gondolin with her son, she is welcomed back by her brother Turgon, who promises Maeglin the highest honour in his realm. But they have been pursued by the aggrieved Eol, who orders his son to return with him to his own kingdom, and when Maeglin is reluctant to obey his father's bidding, Eol attempts to kill him with the cast of a spear. But Arathel fatally intercepts the blow, and in retribution Eol is thrown from the battlements of the city, foretelling that his son will eventually meet the same fate.
So you forsake your father and his kin, ill-gotten son. Here shall you fail of all your hopes. And here may you yet die the same death as
All the dramatic text for this first triptych, that is, a set of 3 scenes, has been drawn from the writings which Tolkien penned in the final years of his life, as Christopher Tolkien explains in The History of Middle-earth, and most of the words are drawn directly from the published Silmarillion. For the second triptych, I turn to the version of the tale Tolkien wrote in the period immediately after The Lord of the Rings, which Christopher Tolkien published in Unfinished Tales. This describes how the mortal man Tuor comes to the shores of the sea and there encounters the sea god Ulmo in his own turn. The Valar gives him a message to convey to Turgon, and he is arrayed in the armour which the latter had been instructed to leave for him. Ulmo also provides Tuor with a guide in the shape of the elf Veronwe, who tells the wandering mortal of his own travails in the ocean and his distant vision of the blessed realm of the Valar, which he has vainly endeavoured to reach. His ship has been wrecked in a storm, but he recognises the importance of Tuor's errand and leads him to the hidden entrance to the city of Gondolin. In earlier versions of the story, Tolkien had told how Tuor received the message of Ulmo in the calm environs of the mouths of the river Silmarillion, but in the 1950s the story was changed and expanded to the vision of the storm which we encounter in this musical setting. Tuor tells Veronwe of his encounter in the poem At the Horns of Ulmo, written originally in 1914 but revised much later to incorporate the later version of the story.
In a dim and perilous region, in whose great tempestuous ways I heard no sound of men's voices, in those eldest of days I sat on the ruined margin of the deep-voiced echoing sea, whose endless roaring music crashed in
When Tuor and Voronwë reach Gondolin, they are at first refused entry until Tuor reveals himself in the armour of Turgon, and the latter now greets him as the messenger of Ulmo. But he refuses the counsel of the Valar, either to assemble his people to fight Morgoth, or to abandon Gondolin and flee down to the sea. It is before this point that Tolkien's revised version of the story comes to an end, and the text reverts back to the 1917 original, where the foundation of the city had been entirely the responsibility of Turgon himself. It is unclear how Tolkien would ultimately have resolved this discrepancy in the king's motivation. In the abridged version included in the Silmarillion, it is simply stated that Turgon had grown proud. But in all the versions of the story, we are now told that Tuor settles in Gondolin for love of Idril, whom he eventually weds. This is much to the displeasure of Maeglin, who himself has desired his cousin's hand, and it is this jealousy which leads in due course to his treachery. The wedding march for Tuor and Idril, which opens the third triptych, includes passages to evoke the ringing of bells, out of which grows a long lyrical theme. This lyrical theme will subsequently return as an extended violin solo lamenting the fall of the city. Tolkien's dramatic dialogue for the third triptych is drawn entirely from the earliest versions of the legend as written in 1917, including his extensive description of the battle raging in the streets following the assault of Morgoth, acting on the treacherous advice of Maeglin. But most of the lyrics here come from various poems written at different times, many of them clearly designed to link to the story of Gondolin, which is referenced more than once by its alternative name of Gondobar, the City of Stone. The love duet for Tuor and Idril is the complete setting of the 1920s poem, The Song of Aelfwine, otherwise known as The Nameless Land, which, as Christopher Tolkien observes, appears to have been further revised during the years following the completion of The Lord of the Rings. After the brief scene depicting Maeglin's betrayal of Gondolin to Morgoth, the text drawn from the 1917 Lost Tale, we encounter another, much later poem. In nearly all versions of the story, Tolkien describes how Morgoth's assault on the city begins during a festival where the elven inhabitants are commemorating the arrival of summer, but he never wrote any text for their celebratory hymn. In order to supply the omission, I have had recourse to an Elvish poem written for the Lost Road in the late 1930s, a paean to Numenor, which was abridged even before it found its way into that incomplete novel. With very minor changes, substituting the name of Gondolin for Numenor, it became a hymn to Ilúvatar, the one of Tolkien's mythology. As Tolkien tells in the Silmarillion, the red light mounted the hills in the north and not in the east, and the sack of Gondolin by the forces of Morgoth is now accomplished. Turgon is slain in the downfall of his tower, and Tuor, during his rescue of Idril and their son Eärendil, casts Maeglin from the walls of the city, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Eöl at the end of the first triptych. He and Idril then lead the survivors in flight down towards the sea. In Tolkien's original story, Tuor and Idril eventually set sail into the west, seeking Valinor, and it is left to their son Eärendil to fulfil the prophecy and bring the aid of the Valar to the beleaguered enemies of Morgoth, resulting in what Elrond, in The Lord of the Rings, is to wistfully recall as a period when the elves deemed that evil was ended forever, and it was not so. But for this concluding great tale of Eärendil, Tolkien wrote very little of a completed version, and almost no dialogue that could be employed to bring the cycle of epic scenes to a conclusion. I therefore provide an epilogue that combines two of Tolkien's poems. One is The Happy Mariners, written originally in 1915, but continually revised until at least 1940, which seems to have been identified as the Song of the Sleeper in the Tower of Pearl. This mysterious being was clearly intended at one time to provide an incident in the Lay of Eärendil, although what this might have been is almost impossible to guess. But in one solitary note, Tolkien suggests that the character might have been Idril herself. It is a poem addressing those voyaging beyond the seas from one who has been left behind, and I have taken this as a cue to provide a lament for Idril, which brings the work to a conclusion at the same time as the chorus sing a salutation to those who follow Eärendil without rest. The situation, in other words, in some ways anticipates that at the end of The Lord of the Rings, and, just as Frodo there hears the sound of singing that came over the water, here a distant semi-chorus gives us the elvish poem The Last Ark, written in 1931 but revised much later. Christopher Tolkien speculates that it may have been in the last decade of his father's life.
I know a window in a western tower that opens on celestial seas. From wells of dark behind the stars that ever blaze, the keen and earthly breeze. Its feet are washed by waves that never rest. Silent boats go by into the west, all piled and twinkling in the dark with orient fire, with many a morning star. That divers one in waters of the rumored sun.
I have said very little in this discussion about the actual construction of the music for the Silmarillion and the Fall of Gondolin. That is because, in another talk, I will be explaining some of the techniques I used to clothe the words in harmony and melody, and I will also be playing other extracts from the recording to illustrate this. In the meantime, we will conclude appropriately with the very closing bars of the work, as Idril bids farewell to her husband.